Call the roll.
Yes, Mr. Chair. Mr. Weddleton.
Here.
Ms. Zalatel.
Here.
Mr. Dunbar.
Here.
Ms. Kennedy.
Here.
Mr. Rivera.
Present.
Ms. LaFrance.
Here.
Mr. Peterson.
Present.
Mr. Constant.
Here.
Ms. Quinn Davidson.
Guess what?
Here.
Mr. Perez Verdilla. Mr. Perez Verdilla.
Here.
Mr. Dyson. You have a quorum.
Thank you, Madam Clerk, and I'll just say I want to thank my colleagues who have agreed to call in. These are extraordinary times. We are trying to maintain appropriate social distancing. If you look at the dais tonight, we've been able to space people out, as has the administration. We have relatively few people in the chambers today. We are trying to lead by doing, but it does create a number of challenges for our clerk staff and particularly for my colleagues on the phone. It's not easy or desirable to call into these kind of meetings. Who would like to? Mr. Slivka, do you want to lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. All right.
I think.
Was also fun to have you join me in having reservation about the thing that gives the mayor must do everything possible. Right. What does it mean? Well, what could it be interpreted?
All right, our first item is ordinance 4A, ordinance number AO 2020-31, an ordinance amending Anchorage Municipal Code 2.30.075 to more broadly define telephonic participation and circumstances wherein members may be telephonic for purposes of establishing a quorum. Assembly Chair Dunbar. We're going to open public hearing now, but we're going to do it a little bit uniquely tonight. Do you have a microphone down there, Jennifer? So you want to speak about our plan tonight?
Yes, Mr. Chair. So we, in an effort to limit the amount of people in chambers, we opened up a new testimony at anchorageak.gov email, and we asked people who wanted to testify over the phone or email to please send us that. We did get some email participation, which you'll see as an AIM on your dais, and then we have 2 people that would like us to phone them to provide public testimony. They're not necessarily on number 4A, but we thought we could take public testimony at the beginning to let those 2 people have a chance to provide testimony to you.
Okay, so you want to do that. I think the intent is to try to get public testimony done on all of the items now. Do we need to change the order of the day?
No, I don't believe the one question that you want to address is the late on the table item. Otherwise, you're at new public hearings. So you're good to go for new public hearings. The question is, do you want to have someone move that late on the table item now or later?
Okay. I think we want to get through our... Okay. We want to get through our public testimony now. We'd instructed members of the public that we were going to start at 5:15.
Well, go ahead. I think because we changed the method so that we call them when it's time to speak, it's not as important that we get it all at the front. We could do it as we hit each item,
right?
Then call them. Is that?
Yeah, I think that's fine. Let's do that. We don't have a lot of people here today, so let's just go through as we planned. We'll do public testimony on this item, and then we'll go on. the folks that we were going to call, did they want to speak, which items did they indicate they wanted to speak to?
So I'll note that our first caller is Mr. Ron Oliva. He said he may like to testify on 4A, B, and C.
Okay,
So you might want to make that one phone call.
okay. All right, very well. Let's do that then. So let's call him, and we're going to ask for his public testimony on whichever ones he wishes to testify on, okay?
I think the ACLU, woman from ACLU wanted to speak on 2 of these as well.
Yeah.
Did you get those emails?
Yes, through the chair, she has requested to speak on items 4B and 4C2.
Okay. All right, so we'll just stick with the order we're in then. So we're on 4A. Public testimony is now open. We're going to start with a call. Could we call Mr. Aleva and see if he's available to speak to this item, and he'll have 3 minutes. Okay. All right. Is there anyone in the chamber? Oh, we got him? Okay. We cannot hear him yet.
Mr. Oliva, can you hear us?
Yes.
All right. Can we make that a little louder so my colleagues can hear?
It's on the top volume.
Mr. Aleva, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Okay.
Hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now. So we now have before us item 4A, which is, to more broadly define telephonic participation. Do you have public testimony about this item?
Yes, I do. Just very short and
Okay.
brief.
All right.
Well, I'm concerned about the technology. I know Mr. Dyson isn't there. I don't have it up on my screen, but if you're in the assembly chambers, his seat is vacant. Somehow, I'd like to acknowledge that he's listening other than by you introducing him and taking roll. Because as a participant, I look at everyone who is there, and sometimes, whether it be eye contact or verbally say, Mr. Dyson, you're well aware of this, or refute or endorse something that Mr. Dyson said. By having something visual there, I don't mean a hologram of Mr. Dyson, but an acknowledgement that it's not blank in the chair. So this telephonic communication, I know it's technology moving in the right direction, but I think it's important to create the real atmosphere of an actual meeting and not hear a voice. And so everyone who's absent, I'd like to have something, not only audio, but also video, and I'm sure it's coming down the pike. Plus, for my benefit, I've been learning sign language, thanking Mr. Gates, but how does that transmit when I'm just listening to it, or, you have to have a translator or something. And also, when I registered for this, I made one mistake and I couldn't go backwards. So I want to thank the clerk's office for clearing it up and getting me on the phone now. So I think public participation is important, especially when you're granting these kind of powers.
Thank you, Mr. Aleva. And I'll note that we actually have radically improved our hologram technology, and we have one of Mr. Dyson here tonight.
Okay, and also one last thing about this will cost a little money. So when you move forward with this for another emergency, make sure you have something budgeted for the rental of the hologram material. They're not using them in Disneyland. Maybe you could get them on loan.
Thank you, Mr. Aleva, and we will call you back for the remaining items. Is there anyone else who wishes to testify on this item? Anyone at all? Seeing no one, public testimony is now closed.
Move to approve.
Come to the...
You were dealing with the
All right. Public testimony is back open. Would anyone like to testify? Please identify yourself for the record.
My name is Eugene Carl-Haberman. I live in the Metro Valley. I follow the public process. When the public process is done appropriately, the decision made by the governing body is more likely in the public interest. First thing on this item that's before you, I'd like to remind you of the scenario. You're talking about telephonically. You're talking about being in another location, and your need of a quorum. But how do we know those assembly members that are online be a quorum? They could get off the phone. We would not know it. There's a serious problem with technology, and also you have had difficulty even sitting in your chairs for the meetings. You're all wandering all over. But the fact is, at least you're in the room. We could see you in the room and, do it that way. But the fact is, you don't know, even on the meetings that I've attended in City Hall with you all, you don't know so-and-so left the room, and the audio tape notes that those who was part of the beginning of the meeting. So we have a problem creating a clear record that you are a legitimate quorum if you move this way. Even if you go in this direction, it's impossible to really clarify that this is really true. You need to do it this way. Second is, I noticed the words of reasonable technology. Yeah. I was in a meeting with you today, sole member of the public, and for the public who's listening to this, I'm the sole member of the public in this room. The concern about too many people in the room is, the more concerned is how do we get people to come to these meetings and not and that's been a problem. So the fact is that your technology has already proved yourself is coming from Assemblymember Dunbar this afternoon when they tried to do some testing on technology, because when you go outside this room and you go into the other meeting places and you're not here. Most of those meetings are not in this room. They're over at City Hall. And look at the words that Senator Dunbar said this afternoon in one of the last two meetings. I'm not going to use this, I think, WebEx again. This has been a catastrophe, quote unquote. I remember Assembly Member Peterson, when Assembly members were calling in, he had the look of saying, we can't hear, but no one's saying anything about it. That's a problem. And it's hard enough, even in this room, to make sure you use some microphones and let sure the public knows the microphone's not on and you know it's not on, so we can all hear. Imagine you go into this step. This is catastrophe. And how do you really prove this is a legitimate quorum if you go this step? So, with all due respect, I would not advise going this direction. But I would advise this, that you have all your meetings in this room. Away from that, you have more reliable technology in this room than the meetings you go elsewhere. That would be more suitable, but still I would stay with the direction of this ordinance.
Thank you. Your time has expired. Would anyone else like to testify on this item? What's that? Okay. Mr. Gates, you were in the queue.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and this is Dean Gates. I just was making sure I mentioned there's a laid on the table item for 6A and S version of AR 2020-88. Just wanted to make sure it's not overlooked.
For laid on the table that we will have to introduce later on tonight, correct?
That 88's act.
It's a S version, but I guess you need to accept it as being on the agenda.
Okay.
Sort of like adding to the agenda.
Can we take action on this item first?
Which item?
Then what's currently before us?
Absolutely.
Okay. Great. All right. Would anyone else like to testify on this item? Anyone at all? Seeing and hearing no one, public testimony is now closed. What is the will of the body?
Move to approve. Second.
Moved and seconded. I would note as well, I've gotten a couple of texts that folks on the phone, it's a little bit difficult for them to hear us unless we speak directly into our mic, so I will endeavor to do that as well. I'm guilty of not doing that sometimes. And the clerk wanted to note that she has sanitized all of the mics before we were here. So we are now in debate on item 4A. And for my colleagues, please send me a text if you want to speak. On the phone, in the queue right now, we have Mr. Weddleton.
Okay, thanks. So I support this. And I think Mr. Haberman really highlighted the challenges that we face in an emergency situation. You know, there are lots of uncertainties, and he listed many but not all. This would only be effective or used in the case of an emergency, and it would allow us to do critical business should we not be able to gather 6 of us together. And I think the times we're dealing with now, we're trying very hard to stay separate and work from home or various offices. And this would offer us the benefit of doing that, but only in an emergency situation. I mean, it is definitely, I think we all agree, far preferable that we all meet together where the public can see where we are. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Weddleton. Ms. Zolotel?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to move amendment number 2.
Second.
Moved and seconded.
Amendment just cleans up the language of subsection D as in Delta.
That's correct. It changes the language in D as in Delta to read, when the mayor, governor, or federal government has declared an emergency, a quorum of assembly members may be established with the combined total of members physically or telephonically present. That was moved and seconded. Any discussion on this item? I'm sorry, any discussion on this amendment? Okay, not seeing any discussion, and I'll take a brief pause here to allow my colleagues to speak on the phone or to send me a text message, but I haven't seen anything. It was amendment number 2. She moved, it's LaFrance, Weddleton, and Zolotel amendment. Okay.
We don't have copies.
Yeah, we do. Did everyone?
I didn't have them here.
Okay. You want to pass that down?
I've seen this one. I'll need the others. This one was finely crafted.
Okay. And we have it up on the screen as well? Okay. All right. If members could please vote on this amendment. And Madam Clerk, could you run down all the people who are on the phone?
Yes, Mr. Chair. Do you want to do them first?
Yeah, go ahead.
All right. Ms. Zolotel?
Yes.
Ms. Kennedy?
Yes.
Mr. Rivera?
Yes.
Ms. Quinn Davidson?
Yes.
Mr. Perez Verdilla?
Yes.
All right, the remaining members may begin to vote.
That amendment passes unanimously. We are now on well, actually, no. Would anyone like, Ms. Kennedy, do you want to move your amendment?
Yes, I do. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was just getting ready to text you to put me in the queue. But anyway, I move Kennedy Amendment number 1.
Do we have a second?
Second.
Moved and seconded. Ms. Kennedy, would you like to explain this amendment, please?
Yes, this really is just intended to get rid of the language about approval of the chair for when somebody wants to telephone in. It's Section 1, Page 1, beginning at line 29. So it removes the phrase with advance approval of the chair, so that it will say, unless a member is participating telephonically, a member of the assembly who is physically absent from a regular or special meeting, including an executive session, will be recorded as absent. Then the rest of it goes on to kind of do a little bit of the same thing where it talks about taking the approval part out. So a member of the assembly who is physically absent from a regular or special meeting, including an executive session, and not approved to participate telephonically, must give prior notice to the chair for the absence to be an excused absence.
Thank you, Ms. Kennedy. Is there any discussion on this amendment?
Mr. Chair.
Yes. I'm sorry, we got Ms. LaFrance in the queue first. Ms. LaFrance?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was just going to ask why that was in there in the first place. I know there was a work session on this, but the part about with advance approval of the chair, if there was a specific reason for that in there?
It's existing code. It's not
That's
being
it?
added.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's right. That's what I remember.
And
Thanks.
if Mr. Gates had a good explanation of kind of what effect it has, but he seems to have stepped out of the room.
Okay. Did you have anything else you'd like to speak to, Mr.
Just
Constant?
on a separate note, I am 100% supportive of this concept. However, it was kind of communicated to me by our counsel that, in his opinion, it's better for this to wait, to be a separate ordinance and not to be wrapped up underneath the emergency meeting that we're having now, because it may have unanticipated consequences, a number of which had been discussed in an email. And so as much as I 100% support the concept, I'm going to be a no vote until we've had a time to regularly introduce this conversation and run it through our process.
Thank you, Mr. Constant. Ms. Quinn Davidson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks to Ms. Kennedy for raising this issue. I was initially going to sign on to the amendment, so I was privy to the emails that we exchanged to craft it, and I have the same concern Mr. Constant had, which is that Mr. Gates requested that we actually wait on this until we're outside of a special meeting, since this doesn't specifically relate to those things that we need to do tonight. But then I have a couple a question for Ms. Kennedy. So I will be a no vote, but I also, did you notice that in the third from bottom line, it says not approved to participate telephonically? Did you want to change that as well? Because I think the whole approval concept is, the idea is to take that out, correct? If I may, Mr. Chair?
Yes, please.
I think there are a couple of things that are somewhat problematic with it, and with what was suggested by Mr. Gates is what you see before you. But I think for me, for my purposes right now, and I would be willing to kind of bifurcate this and just take out that first sentence, because I have the biggest problem with the idea of having to have advance approval by the chair in order to call in. And one of my concerns with that is not so much having to have approval, but you could certainly make that argument. But it was the idea that in this time when we are kind of under this emergency declaration and things kind of happen at a moment's notice, we didn't want to have to be limited to being allowed to participate telephonically until we had permission by the chair to do so. You know, and I know there could just be circumstances by which you need to call in right away. Maybe you were planning on driving in, maybe things changed, but now you can't actually be counted as present if you haven't had advance approval by the chair to call in. And I would say, practically speaking, we don't do that anyway. At least I haven't, so maybe that's just my bad. But anyway, I just figured that this was a good time to kind of get rid of that, at least that one phrase, with advance approval of the chair, so that we weren't hampered in some way or would be considered an absent vote because we were calling in without having had that advance approval. So I think there are a couple of things to deal with in this, but I would be happy if we just dealt with that first part for this particular purpose.
Okay, I've got Ms. Quinn Davidson wants to respond, and I've got Ms. LaFrance in the queue.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And if Mr. Gates is there, perhaps he can speak to this. But I had asked a question earlier today of, is there any significance to an excused absence versus an unexcused absence? Because essentially, if all you have to do is give notice for your absence to be excused, if there's some reason for the unexcused absence, that does away with that. And he said, yes, there is a reason. The reason is that if a certain number of unexcused absences occur, I believe that person can be subject to recall and other things. And so there's actually a lot going on here. And that's one of the reasons that I feel like this isn't the right time to cover this, even though I completely support what Ms. Kennedy's trying to do. I just think it's not necessary right now, and I'm worried we'll have unintended consequences. So if Dean could speak to that if he's back, I would appreciate that.
Thank you, Ms. Quinn Davidson. Mr. Gates, do you have any thoughts on what Ms. Quinn Davidson just said?
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I looked at this, and the difference between excused and unexcused seemed to be pointed out in this section for removal of an elected official from office and for assembly members. One grounds for removal is breach of the public trust. And then section 27030 of the code about the removal process, it lists like 12 things that can constitute grounds for breach of the public trust. One of them is 3 unexcused absences. I think it might say consecutive unexcused absences. So if you get excused absences and unexcused absences, there's a difference here in terms of having grounds for someone to file an accusation for removal from office and so forth. And of course, we all hope we never see that happen. But I think if you want to amend and change the process for having an absence be excused or unexcused, that you want to take a broader look at how that would work in Chapter 270 or Section 270-30 of the Code as well, and maybe make an amendment there. So that's one reason I said we should maybe look at this and take a little more time to vet this change. And then again, as Mr. Constant mentioned earlier, the purpose of having the special meetings is to focus on changes to code we have in these ordinances that were to help us in the current COVID-19 pandemic. And this change, to me, has nothing to do with it. So I think we could handle this change in a separate ordinance in the near future.
Thank you, Mr. Gates. Ms. LaFrance?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Gates answered most of the questions I had. A follow-up question to Mr. Gates. In the code that you referenced, 270.30, or I'm not sure which what that section is titled, but is there somewhere in code, I assume there is, that states that the chair has the power, or it's the chair's responsibility and authority to determine alone which absences are excused and unexcused?
The only place I know of right now is here in the section you're looking at. But here, what difference it makes is if the chair's exercising some judgment, if you have a good excuse or bad excuse, then he decides it's excused or not. Whereas with this change, all you have to do is give notice. So if you've given notice, then you're automatically excused. And there's no judgment if it was a good reason to be excused or not. You know, as Mrs. Kennedy had some examples about her car breaking down on the way to the meeting, that sounds like a pretty good reason. But if we're going to Europe on vacation for a couple months, maybe not. So I think that this is probably the reason the code in the section you're looking at here, 230.75A, is written that way so that there was at least a little discretion. And also here at the beginning of a meeting, when you're taking roll call, you decide someone's absent, the chair say they're excused or unexcused. That's one of those chair determinations that the rest of the body can challenge if someone wanted to, and then take a vote to decide that, yes, that was a good reason or not. So it's not entirely up to the chair. It's subject to an objection or challenge from a member of the body to put to a vote.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Constant?
Thank you. So, again, hearing that explanation doesn't do anything to make me want to change this code. It doesn't make me want any less to change this section of code. I am fully in agreement that I don't want the chair telling me if or if not my rationale for not attending this meeting is excused or not. It's just not a power I'm willing to grant. I am a self-determining person, and so I'm willing to have that conversation, and I believe it should be changed, and we can come up with some way, whether maybe it's a body as opposed to the chair has the determination should the call be made or need to be made. But I don't believe now is the time for us to be answering this question. I believe it should be done in the fullness of time with a thoughtful conversation about all the elements of code that are brought to bear and under consideration. And so I think that we should take this up, but I think we should take it up in the fullness of time.
Thank you, Mr. Constant. Mr. Weddleton?
I think he just said, you're not the boss of me.
Yes. Mr. Peterson?
Mr. Chair,
Yeah, Ms. Kennedy?
thank you. If you don't have anybody else in the queue, I guess.
I have Mr. Peterson in the queue, actually.
Okay, I will wait then. Just put me in the queue.
Oh, thank you. Mr. Peterson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And, you know, there are situations where you had intended to call in and gave notice to the chair that you intended to call in, and sometimes you're unable to do that. I found myself in that situation a little over a year ago when I was in Costa Rica. I went to a phone store and thought I had my phone all set to call back in for the meeting, and it didn't work. And so I was unable to call in. Was able to send a text or an email to let everybody know that my intention to call in was not going to actually happen, and so then I was given an excused absence. So sometimes things are fluid and they things happen that are unanticipated. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Peterson. Ms. Kennedy?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd be happy to withdraw the amendment if I get an answer to this question, and this might be your question, Mr. Dunbar. Because we have to call in advance to get approval to be able to call in and participate telephonically, what format does that look like? Does that mean that we text you? Does that mean we actually send an email and ask for that approval? That's my hang up in all of this, is that particular thing about having to have advance approval by the chair. So anyway, that's something that, like I said, I haven't done in the past, and so that could very well be my misstep, and obviously I want to correct that. But so my question is, what does getting approval in order to be able to participate telephonically look like, and how do we proceed since we're trying to give ourselves the ability to participate telephonically more readily? Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Kennedy. I'll say that in my experience, 4 years on the body and 4 chairs, I think, maybe 5 including myself, 4. It's always been a notice, not an excusal. I've never heard of someone not being approved, quote unquote approved. But typically, yeah, it could be a text, it could be a call, it could be an email, it could even be an in-person meeting the day before. I have done that myself with prior chairs, and then usually have people tell me in advance I'm intending to call in. I think given our current circumstances, especially if this passes, I think the assumption will be that most people call in until the COVID-19 pandemic subsides. But in general, I do think it's practice, and if I'm on even a committee, I typically let the committee chair know if I'm not going to be there. But it's a form of notice, not approval. Practically speaking, that has been the practice in my term on the Assembly. We have Mr. Dyson in the queue and Mr. Constant. But Ms. Kennedy, you had mentioned you might be willing to withdraw this amendment?
I will,
Okay.
just because, if there's no support in it, if it's confusing, people are hung up on the part that they didn't want to deal with yet, which was the excused absence.
Yep.
So if we're not willing to deal with the idea of advance approval, which, like I said, was what I was targeting, then I don't see the point of trying to get people to vote on something that they're not really exactly voting on. So anyway, I will withdraw this amendment.
Thank you. Who was the second? Mr. Dyson, will you withdraw the second?
Yes, and I'd still like to speak.
Yes. Okay. And I'll say for my colleagues, I have never before denied a reason, and I don't intend to in this time of COVID-19. It does help me and the clerk's office too if we have notice, if we just know who's going to be here and who is not. For Tuesday night's meeting, I think the default will be most folks will call in, will not be physically present. Mr. Dyson?
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate.
Your microphone is off.
I appreciate Mr. Constance, Ms. Kennedy's concerns about this. I think Mr. Constant and I have these concerns because we know more screwed up jerks than most of you do who will abuse these things. And certainly just good manners is to let people know and so on and so forth. We're not school children. We got to raise our hand before we go to the restroom. And I've never seen it abused in this body. I have seen it in other ones. And I have seen and suffered from very dictatorial leaders that wanted to punish people for how they voted or what they did, and so on. But we indeed, if one of our colleagues has a pattern of messing things up and continually, their lack of performance and so on, we can pass a resolution saying Mrs. So-and-so is a jerk and is a pain to work with, and so on and so forth. And in terms of people attending or not, in some senses, that's between them and the voters. I'm glad to have Eugene publish my attendance record and the times when I've fallen asleep or my mind has drifted away, and you can do the same thing with community council and so on and so forth, and tell my voters, tell my supporters about it. Anyways, I hope you all deal with this, and also I would encourage at that time that committee meetings not be mandatory, but still that we let people know ahead of time. Thank you.
Thank you, Hologram Dyson. Mr. Constant.
Oh, are we in debate then, since the motion has been withdrawn?
Yes, we're now talking about the underlying item.
So for me, I'm very supportive. The only thing that I don't like about it is that I personally would have changed the word telephonic to electronic, and in every instance, because we can simplify this procedure for the future now, and instead, because telephonic communication, we don't have wires between cans anymore, it's actually electronic, and every other form of communication that might evolve over time is electronic. And so I think it would be a cleaner change to make, rather than just changing the definition of telephonic to mean electronic. But I don't want to get down in the weeds and make sausage up here, so I'll be supportive.
Thank you, Mr. Constant. Would anyone else like to speak on this item? I'll pause here. Any of my colleagues on the phone, if you want to shoot me a text. Okay, I'm not seeing any, I'm sorry, I just got someone confused about the hologram reference came into me electronically. I will not make that joke anymore. That was a callback to an earlier part of the meeting. I realize it's difficult enough to follow this meeting. I apologize for that. Okay, so with that, please vote on this item. Madam Clerk.
Ms. Zalatel?
Yes.
Ms. Kennedy?
Yes.
Mr. Rivera?
Yes.
Ms. Quinn Davidson?
Yes.
Mr. Perez Verdilla?
Yes.
That item passes unanimously. Could I get a motion to incorporate item 6A1 into the agenda?
Move to incorporate.
Second, Weddleton.
Do we need a third for that, Madam Clerk? Okay, we don't need a third. That is now incorporated into the agenda. Do we need to vote on that motion? Okay. Is there any objection to the motion to incorporate the late on the table item 6A1, which is 2020-88S, AR 2020-88S onto the agenda? Is there any opposition to that motion to incorporate? Hearing and seeing none, that is now incorporated. We are now on item 4B, ordinance number AO 2020-33, an ordinance of the Anchorage Assembly amending the Anchorage Municipal Code, Chapter 28.150, regarding the emergency plan for elections to clarify the scope of the municipal clerk's power to preserve the integrity of the election during unforeseeable events affecting an election, introduced by myself, Assembly Chair Dunbar. Public testimony is now open. Would anyone like to testify? Let's do the in-person first. Come on down. Come on down.
My name is Eugene Carl Haberman. I live in the Matsu Valley. I follow the public process. When the public process is done appropriately, the decision made by the governing body is more like the public interest. I looked at this document real carefully, read it several times. There's not much in it to read, but it puts out a big alarm. You passed this thing tonight. That basically means the election that's happening right now, the 2020 election, this is what's going to be a factor to, not the future election. And it's talking about making changes. It's also saying in here, a notice of changes may but is not required to be published in a newspaper general circulation. We're talking about a situation where what's going to be open, what's not going to be open, and how can the public really participate in an election. I'd like to remind you of one key thing. I came back into the picture in 2012 when more than 40% of the polling precincts ran out of ballots even though it printed enough. That's what brought me back into this situation and seeing the process and so forth. And it's alarming. One would think that you should have basically maybe delayed the election, but then you're saying the cost of those ballots and so forth. The argument would be is also the scenario as well. There's vote by mail. That's alleviated a good deal of the problem. But let them look at the voter response to participations since you went to vote by mail. It's greatly deteriorated from the time when you didn't. Voter participation has gone down. Yes, it has, Councilman Constant. It has. Stop shaking your head. Listen to the public for once. So what I'm also alarmed is Wednesday's meeting, Barbara Jones made a remark that said, in reference to that 2012 election, that if we had the hours, 2 more hours longer, that would have rectified that situation. Tell that to the people who tried to vote in that election. That's what's going on. The lack of dealing with that election is now taking us this election, and what has changed? A pattern to make sure the public is not connected. Now, where's the conversation with the people on this? Now, I know there's a crisis going on, and we're all concerned about that. But I want to stress this key point. The conversation between the people and you on these issues, where is that? You had a 5 o'clock meeting when most people are working, if they can go to work. I'm the only one for the public in this room. Only one from a member of the public speaking. And this has been moved fast from last week. Last Thursday, notice introduced on Thursday and moved these 3 items. So with all due respect, I don't have faith in what's happening.
Thank you. Your time has expired.
Any questions?
Okay. Madam Clerk, Madam Deputy Clerk, do we have anyone on the phone?
Mr. Chair, we're going to phone Triada Stampis to speak to item 4B.
Okay. Hello, Ms. Stampis. You are currently before the Anchorage Assembly. Would you like to offer testimony for item 4B, AO number 2020-33, regarding the powers of the clerk?
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you. You will have, if you could identify yourself for the record, you'll have 3 minutes.
Great. Thank you. My name is Triada Stampis. I'm the Policy Director for the American Civil Liberties Union of Alaska, based here in Anchorage. Thank you for the opportunity to provide feedback on this ordinance, which would expand the emergency powers of the municipal clerk in order to protect the integrity of elections. We recognize that this is a public health threat on an unprecedented scale, and we are all in this together. So first and foremost, the ACLU of Alaska wants to be a resource to you as this situation evolves and as issues, new issues potentially emerge over time. States and municipalities are confronting these and similar issues across the country, and we are part of a national ACLU network in all 50 states that is learning from these experiences, and that we are able to tap for guidance on best practices. A key principle in the exercise of any emergency powers during a public health crisis is that these powers be justified by science, or actions in the exercise of these powers be justified by science and exercised in the least restrictive means possible, consistent with the guidance of public health experts. In the context of the ordinance in question, 2020-33, we appreciate the additional flexibility that this ordinance gives the municipal clerk to expand voting access in emergencies, such as by accepting applications to vote at temporary addresses or allowing for electronic voting and so forth. However, the decisions that the municipal clerk can make to restrict access to voting, we would ask that this ordinance be amended to reflect that be guided by the advice of public health experts, which is a key principle that we use to evaluate the government's exercise of emergency powers in a public health crisis. And so the ordinance contains a new power to close polling locations, either permanently or temporarily, without the requirement that they be replaced. We would ask that with respect to that power, the ordinance reflects that the closure, that provision should only be invoked in a public health emergency if it is indeed intended to address the current crisis. And we ask that in any public health emergency, any decision to close or relocate locations where people can vote or drop off ballots be made with the concurrence of the municipality's medical officer or another public health authority. Again, thank you so much for the opportunity to testify and the diligence with which you're approaching this work.
Thank you, Ms. Stampis. I don't have any question. Mr. Dyson.
Yeah. Thank you, ma'am, for your testimony. I think the distilled essence was that you want the actions the clerk takes to have a stamp of approval of somebody in administration who has health credentials. Is that correct?
Through the chair, yes, sir, that is correct. That it be that the recognizing that the municipal clerk is not a public health expert, that if restrictions on voting access are happening as a result of a public health crisis, that be done with under the guidance of a public health authority.
Yeah, I heard when you said that the first two times. All right, so you're wanting the health person to weigh in because of the sanitation of how the delivery of ballots and so on and so forth? Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying if locations are going to be closed for public health justifications, that there actually be a public health authority that validates that justification.
So the answer to my question.
Otherwise,
yes.
there's got to be a balance and a recognition that the right to, that folks have the right to vote, and that right has to be balanced against public health needs.
So that's is a legitimate business of ACLU, for which I applaud. So you don't want the restrictions that the clerk makes to be manipulated to enfranchise or disenfranchise some group. Is that your point?
Correct, yeah.
Okay, and so, okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Dyson. All right, thank you, Ms. Stampis. There are no further questions. We're going to go on to our next caller.
We're going to call Mr. Oliva back to testify on this item, unless it is 6 o'clock, Mr. Chair.
Why don't we try to get through Mr. Oliva's testimony, and then we'll close public testimony and have our break. And then we'll come back after the break with debate. While she's doing this, could someone try to fire up the...
Barbecue?
Hello, Mr. Oliva. You're with the Anchorage Assembly.
Yes.
All right, Mr. Oliva, we are now taking public testimony on item 4 Bravo regarding the powers of the clerk. Would you like to testify on this item?
Okay. I was going to just had a couple comments on that because of the emergency plan. And,
Okay, your 3 minutes to start.
Pardon me?
Go ahead, Mr. Oliva.
Oh, okay. Well, what happened, I believe it was in Ohio, was the age of the poll workers. And it just seemed like they were senior citizen watching the polls, and during the emergency, there was no attendance to manage them. And I know we have a very competent clerk, but, when you go to hire them, who applies? Can you discriminate then and try to get a real broad cross-section that this type of emergency we're in, we don't end up with all college-age poll workers and discriminate against senior citizens. And I'm one of them who feels healthy enough to be at the polls, but it wouldn't be good for the general populace. So that's a concern in the emergency plan. And to postpone an election, that takes the wind out of the sails of giving you more time to forget people's positions and their emphasis on issues. And it also gives them time, the politicians running, to change their positions. You've already voted, so there's a lot to be concerned about when you vote on this. And I just wanted to pass on my observations and concerns.
Thank you, Mr. Oliva. There are no questions.
Thank you, Mr. Dunbar.
Okay.
And I'm sorry about the hologram with Mr. Dyson. You see what you look at a blank computer screen. I didn't get to see him, but
No, okay.
Everyone
That's
who's
fine.
in attendance should have a portrait or a sign up that they're on the phone.
Thank you, Mr. Oliva. Okay, so that's all in terms of people that had offered to call in. Is there anyone else here who would like to testify? Seeing here no one, public testimony is now closed. What is the will of the body?
Move to approve.
Moved and seconded. We're going to take a brief break now before we go into debate. We're going to take a sort of a dinner break, but more we're going to watch if we can, we're going to watch the mayor's press briefing that should be starting now. He has an announcement regarding further actions in the face of COVID-19. So we're going to take a brief break.
As a result, it's really important we have people not move around as much right now. And as a result, we're strongly advising that all Alaskans cease all non-essential out-of-state personal, business, and medical travel now. Alaskans currently out of state are encouraged to return home now if they've had plans to return to Alaska within the next 30 days. We strongly advise that any tourists or non-essential business traveling to Alaska suspend their action now, and strongly recommend that visitors to
and last until March 31st. And if we can't take care of ourselves, there's nobody else coming because everyone else is contending with this pandemic at the same time. One of the things that I prize most about living in this state is it is a wide open place. People are free to do what they want to do. But it's also a place where we look out after one another. And this is a time where we need to look out after one another. We know what hunkering down means. We do it when storms come in. We do it when times are tough. We know that we have to make sure that we aren't taxing the resources of our community any more than necessary. What this hunker down order does is say, stay at home as much as possible. If you need to go out to get groceries, go get groceries. If your car is broken, you can go get it fixed. If you have a medical appointment, go take care of that. But don't linger. If you want to go outside and go skiing or running or walking, or go with your dog, go do that. But practice social distancing. It's too easy to look at the data from the World Health Organization or from the Center for Disease Control, to pick up a newspaper or to look online and see the catastrophic consequences of what happens when you're not ready. Anchorage is in a unique position. We are the medical center of Alaska. We are the only game in town for thousands of miles. And we have to take every precaution to make sure that the approximately 1,200 beds don't get overwhelmed. And when you think about what this disease, what the trajectory of this disease looks like, it's easy to see how that can happen. You're hearing projections in the news of 40 to 70% of the population getting infected. Not everybody who gets infected is going to require hospitalization, but even if a small percentage of people do, that would rapidly overwhelm our facilities. Remember, there's 300,000 of us here in Anchorage, 750,000 of us in this state, 1,200 beds here. And think about it, what it might mean if your grandmother or your friend or you couldn't get in to see a doctor or couldn't get the treatment that you needed. This is going to be very personal. And that's why I'm asking people to do the right thing, to think about the consequences of your action. Don't be selfish. Don't expose people to a disease. It doesn't mean that we can't have social interactions. Let's just do it in ways that acknowledge the reality of the situation we're in. Let's practice social distancing, wash our hands as much as we can, don't touch your face. This is a real situation. And we are in a fortunate position as we have seen what has occurred in other places. We know what works in terms of limiting the spread of this disease. One of the unfortunate and unfair consequences of the public response to preventing this disease from getting a toehold in Alaska is that we have visited a high economic cost on people who oftentimes are not in a good position to be able to afford it. And I want to assure everybody that even though our immediate concern is to make sure that we're as healthy as possible, we're going to do everything we can for people who are suffering economic trouble as a consequence here. That is the next phase of where we are. But this order is about making sure that our medical resources are well taken care of, and that Alaska and the people of Alaska and the people of Anchorage are as protected as we possibly can be. So I'm asking everybody, even though this is a hunker down order, use your common sense, do the right things, and make sure that you don't become a vector, you don't become a point of contact that infects other people. Minimize your social contact as much as possible.
I'm speaking for medical professionals from the Alaska Native Health System, from Alaska Regional Hospital, and from the Providence Health System. I want to commend the mayor. This is a bold, courageous move, but absolutely necessary. We have had great fortune of being able to see how this virus has behaved in the rest of the world and now in most of the lower 48. And we've learned some important lessons, and it would be foolish not to take advantage of them. This virus is spread primarily by human-to-human contact. And the experience in China and South Korea, where it was absolutely uncontrolled, has shown us that if you exercise social distancing and keep people from spreading it from person to person, you can absolutely decrease the transmission. And we've also witnessed in places such as northern Italy that when those types of social control measures have not been put in place, the virus spreads uncontrollably and is still spreading. And while a majority of people have an illness that doesn't require hospitalization, a significant number do. And a significant number also die. And those are greater, those mortality rates are greater in the elderly and in those with chronic diseases. And we could literally wipe out a portion of our population without taking measures such as this. We don't have a vaccine for this virus, and we won't for at least a year. And we really don't have any reliable medication, so we're hopeful. So right now, personal hygiene, cleaning surfaces or disinfection, and social distancing are the only tools that we have. Now, we understand that taking measures like this will have an economic cost. People will lose their jobs. Many people have lost other things of value because of the economic impact. But those are all reversible. We can't bring back the people that die from this disease. It really would be foolish not to take a measure like this that we know works. So we in the health community are absolutely in complete support of this type of measure, and we hope that people will exercise those behaviors and understand that we're all personally responsible for personal hygiene and for remaining hunkered down, and this will keep this virus from impacting our community. Without that, I can tell you without any question that our healthcare services would be completely overrun. We will have more people that require hospitalization and critical care than we have resources. We will have to make decisions about who gets care and who doesn't. And I can tell you as a provider, that is extremely painful and unfair to the patients we're treating, but also unfair to the healthcare workers. So we really implore you to take this seriously and help us prevent this virus from spreading. Thank you.
I just want to say one other thing that occurred to me when Dr. Bernstein was speaking is I've been around Alaskans a lot, and I've seen all kinds of selfless behavior. I've seen people rush into danger because they are trying to help someone else. I've seen people be incredibly generous under trying economic times, and this is one of the circumstances that calls for selflessness. And I just want people to imagine what happens if this disease gets too big of a toehold here. Not only will the general population be affected and afflicted, which will overwhelm our healthcare facilities, but the people who provide the healthcare are also susceptible to infection. And as those people get infected, our collective ability to take care of those who are sick is diminished. And that's why it's really critical to prevent this disease from growing too rapidly and to too great an extent. Because the more we act, the better off we're going to be. So I just wanted to bring that point home.
So we'll open it up for questions. If anybody has questions, if you could self-identify and speak loudly. If everybody on the panel, when answering questions, could speak loudly too, so that folks on the stream can hear. Any questions?
So I'm Sammy Selena. I'm a reporter with Channel 2 KTUU. What are the guidelines for businesses that are doing takeout, that are opened up for coffee, that sort of thing?
Those will maintain as they are right now. Takeout is fine. People going grocery shopping is still acceptable. We're going to ask the grocery stores to make sure that there's social distancing that's practiced, that they not have too dense a packing of people inside their stores. But there should be no change in terms of people being able to do takeout.
Albert Weaver, ADN. Are there any other restrictions on businesses, like non-service industry businesses? I know for a while people have been asked to work from home, but not everybody does that. Any regulations on that?
Well, we asked, at the municipality, we've gone to a work from home as much as possible. And I encourage businesses to do that as much as possible. We've itemized the kind of businesses that we want to continue to operate because we have to maintain the functionality of our society, and we can do that. But and there's some mandates that are contained in here, but it's primarily we're asking people to use their common sense. If you don't need to work from work, if you can do it from a distance, do it that way. What we're really trying to do is minimize social contact. The more social contact that there is, the more likely that the disease has an ability to jump from one individual to another.
I have another question. Sammy with Channel 2. How is this different than past orders? Is it just official now, more official, that there's an order out, people need to stay home? And is there going to be any enforcement of this?
So this is different in that past orders were about personal protective equipment. There was another one that had to do with bars and restaurants. This is more general, and it affects primarily, in practical terms, retail establishments. And that will be the big group that is asked to not stay open unnecessarily. We want to make sure, though, that there's continuity of operations for critical things like power, waste, and all of the component parts of our society, because it's more than an economy, but our society that allow people to be functional. But this is, as much as anything else, this is a call for people of Anchorage to minimize their social contacts, not be isolated in that sense, but to minimize the actual physical contacts. In terms of enforcement, yes, there's obviously some enforcement tools that we have here, but I'm asking people to use their common sense and their common decency and to make sure that we do everything we can to protect not just ourselves, but each other. I mean, the more we're out and around, the more we expose ourselves to the risk that we personally can get the disease, and the more, and even if we're asymptomatic, we also run the risk of being a transmitter. And that's something I don't think anyone wants. And if I'm wrong with my medical analysis, I'm sure that there are folks here who will correct me.
I have a question for Dr. Bernstein. Earlier today it was announced that the city has a shortage on the swabs for testing. Can you give me kind of just an update on what the public health infrastructure is like now, and what the concerns are going forward?
So we're actively pursuing many sources in our supply chain to get additional swabs. As of this morning, we felt we had about 5 days supply, but we just identified an additional swab that we have used for another type of test that we'll be able to use, so that has extended our supply, and then we're all working through our systems to look even globally at what we can get. We're also developing new tests that might allow us to use different techniques to test for the virus. The other supply issue, of course, is the protective gear that our healthcare personnel use to keep them from catching the disease. And we've begun pretty extreme conservation measures. So historically, these were kind of one-time use. We would wear them into a patient room, we come out, we would throw them away. But there are things that you can do. You can put one mask over another, the one that we have a greater supply over the one that's more sophisticated to protect it, and use that for an entire shift. And we're exercising all of these things. In addition, the companies that manufacture them have just told us that they can reprocess them. They can sterilize them and make sure that they are up to speed so they can be reused. So we're now collecting all of those and sending them back. We also, in our health system, we just started a 100 million masks campaign, and many companies that manufacture other really seemingly unrelated things like furniture are retooling parts of their factories and producing masks. We have workers who, because of the cancellation of elective surgeries and non-essential healthcare tasks, workers that don't have anything else to do, we have them working on assembling face shields. So it's an all-out effort. It reminds me of the stories when I was little. I used to hear about everybody going to work in various ways for World War II. It's an all-out effort because we've seen what happens in places when you run out of those types of supplies. The healthcare workers cannot protect themselves.
Scott Gross, KTVA Television. Can you tell me how the COVID drive-up area is doing? I know that started out slowly as a slow launch on Monday. We're not, do you expect results to get back there? I guess for me, it started Monday, here we are Friday. It's quite remarkable that we haven't had more positive tests come through Anchorage, especially through that drive-through setup that you guys have together.
So, and the other two health systems at the table here have cooperated with us in standing up that drive-through. We had a slow Monday, but I know yesterday we had 250 people drive through and get tested, and I think today we were going to be at or exceed that level. Those tests are actually being sent to the lower 48, but today we actually received results on tests that were sampled on the 17th of March. So a pretty remarkable turnaround for being sent to Arizona. Fortunately, they've virtually all been negative. It changes rapidly, but I think I've heard that there have been 13 positives in the state of Alaska, and I believe they were all individuals who flew in from outside. So the question is, did any of those individuals spread the virus to somebody? The likelihood is yes. We're hoping no, but I think we're going to find out in the next week or two.
Are there plans to open up other drive-thrus like that one, or are you going to keep just that one?
Holly, do you want to comment?
Well, I think we're looking to have one on site at ANMC to try to take some of the load off the drive-through. So we're working on that. I think one of the biggest problems is just the supplies that we need to do the testing. So I think that we're much better able to set up testing sites than we are to have the supplies to actually do the testing. So that's why we're really being so serious about who should be tested, because just like the
Thank you. All right. We're going to call this meeting back to order. We had a motion and a second, and we're now debating, let's see here, I'm sorry. Just give me a moment to make sure we've still got folks on the phone. Oh, we got it. Well, no, we have a quorum because we have people here, so we are fortunate we don't need to confirm that people are on the phone, although I've received texts from all of them that says that they are online. So for those who might be watching at home, we just heard that there's a new hunker down order, and my vice chair's business just closed. Apologies to Mr. Weddleton.
I'd speak to that. It's that's going to be very hard. We at my business have talked about all the different stages we would hit, and we planned for this happening, and I just texted them to shut it down. And it's very hard. At this point, I'll keep my staff on. We'll have other projects to do as long as we can. So, it's hard for every business, but, I think it's really what we have to do. And it's just the way it is. So.
Thank you, Mr. Weddleton. Okay, so now we are debating for Bravo, which is discussing the emergency powers of the clerk. Are there any amendments or any discussion?
Mr. Chair, I'd like to start the discussion, if I may.
Oh, I apologize, Ms. Zolotel. Yeah, I said that you could do that. Please go ahead.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I reached out to the clerk earlier with comments from the ACLU, and I wonder if the clerk could take a moment to speak to those comments and the suggested changes.
Yes. Madam Clerk, would you like to speak to those changes?
Yes, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Ms. Zolotel. There is two things that I would like to point out to the Assembly about the emergency plan that's before you. First of all, this is in a separate chapter called Emergency Plan, and we didn't include the policy in the ordinance that's before you, and I just want to read it to you because I think it's really good. And it says that the policy of the municipality is to encourage and assist voters in the exercise of their right to vote. It does say certain unforeseeable circumstances through natural disaster or human error or other similar events could severely impede the timely and efficient conduct of elections. This chapter is intended to empower the clerk to take actions necessary to enfranchise voters and protect the election results. I just love that language. Sorry about that. The next section of the policy goes on, and it talks some more about what these are, what these powers are. So I want to tell you that these powers and the proposal from the ACLU is really unnecessary, and it's overly restrictive. And one of the reasons that I believe that it's overly restrictive, and this is the discussion that Ms. Zolotel and I had, and so let me check with you so I can tell you what I told Ms. Zolotel. I forwarded this to some of you this afternoon. So this proposal to be able to close accessible vote centers, if it was limited to a public health emergency, it would not cover a situation where we had a 1964 earthquake and all of the AVCs were structurally damaged. Or I also suggested, what if there was a terrorist attack? In both of these situations, there could be a declaration of an emergency by a governor or a mayor or the federal government, but it also could be that there wasn't. And what this section and the previous section that I read to you, it allows the clerk to exercise those powers based on what's happening right now in that election. And so I think that you don't want to limit this power to a public health emergency. I also would be happy to discuss and debate this with you, but I am just concerned that now is not the time. Also, the last thing I wanted to point out to the Assembly is that there is another check and balance on the clerk. And you know, I hope this would never happen to me or any other clerk, but it's an election contest. And if a clerk did something during the election or something happened during an election, the public could file an election contest. And this clerk, and I don't think any clerk, wants to end up in a situation where you redo an election because you didn't allow people to vote. And I can just tell you, the clerk's office and the clerk's mission is to make sure every vote counts. We want people to vote. We don't want to restrict anyone from voting. So that's it from me, unless you have some questions.
Thank you. I have Mr. Peterson in the queue. Before that, Ms. Zolotel, do you have any follow-ups to that?
No, thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Zolotel. Mr. Peterson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I just wanted to point out that the Ethics and Election Committee had discussions about electronic voting, voting via computer, and we were worried that that might weaken the integrity of our election system. We've created a system at our election center that is as secure as any election center in the country that I'm aware of. And if we did allow computer voting, there's a possibility that integrity might be lost. And so, and unless it's absolutely necessary, we would prefer that voters not vote via computer. And so if you plan far enough ahead and get us your address, we can send you a ballot at a temporary address, and that would be much, much preferred by us. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Peterson. Mr. Constant, we had a discussion at the work session about adding whereas clauses, but I don't believe, I don't recall from the work session who that was sort of tasked to, and it slipped my mind. Was anyone able to draft whereas clauses? Do you wish to take up the next item and have someone draft whereas clauses in the interim?
We should just get the work done. I just feel that it is disconnected in time and place as it is, and all the assurances that it will be associated with the AM don't give me much comfort when I have asked for and tried to seek out and search for ordinances and resolutions for years, and rarely do they come accompanied by their associated documents unless you get them right from the clerk, which is always the best way to do it, but not often the way it is done. And so reality is this will be disconnected from this current circumstance and why we did it. So, but again, I think we just get on with the show because we have work to do.
Okay. I mean, it wouldn't be very difficult. We could move on to 4C. That is going to take us a long time to get through, and someone else could draft it while we wait.
I just don't want to miss 4C while I'm helping someone draft that. So.
Okay. All right. So, is there any other discussion I'm sorry, Mr. Peterson. Oh, you already spoke. I'm sorry, I didn't take you out of the queue. Is there anyone else? Mr. Weddleton.
I want to speak briefly on this. I mean, no one wants to do these things, but again, we're in tough times, and we'll have future tough times and earthquakes and snowstorms and so on, and we need to think about what to do. Mr. Haberman had said that the election in 2012, there were too few ballots, and that was a problem. But I believe this would actually allow extension of voting to prevent that from being a problem. So, kind of real things that have happened in the past would have been solved by what we have in front of us. So I will support this. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Weddleton. And as Mr. Haberman has said repeatedly, the 2012 election is what motivates him to be here to testify. So perhaps if we resolve the problems that led to the 2012 election, he can, stay in the Mat-Su Valley. Perhaps. Okay, so with that, is there any other discussion? Anyone on the phone? Okay, seeing none, please vote on this item.
Ms. Zolotel?
Yes.
Ms. Kennedy?
Yes.
Mr. Rivera?
Yes.
Ms. Quinn Davidson?
Yes.
Mr. Perez Verdilla?
Yes.
That item passes unanimously. We are now on item 4C. Pardon me. Ordinance number AO 2020-34, an ordinance amending Anchorage Municipal Code, Chapter 3.80, Civil Emergency, to provide specific authority for the mayor to declare a public health emergency and exercise powers relating to the examination, treatment, isolation, and quarantine of persons having or suspected of having a contagious disease, introduced by the Department of Law, and I believe there is an S version of this. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay. So public testimony is now open. Would anyone like to testify? Why don't we start with people in the room, and while we're doing that, could you get someone on the phone?
Mr. Chair, I think I have to do it. There's no way for me to communicate with them.
Okay.
Once I get them on the phone to let them know they're on hold, other than just doing it out in the open. So.
Oh, I gotcha. Okay. All right. So for the people who are here, please, if you'd like to testify, please testify on this item.
Excuse me, Mr. Chair, I do not have the S version of this one.
Okay. Could we have the S version sent out to my colleagues again?
I'll do that, Jennifer.
All right. The clerk is emailing that out now. You should look for an email from Ms. Jones. In the meantime, we'll start taking public testimony.
My name is Eugene Carl Haberman. I live in the Matsuo Valley. I follow the public process. When the public process is done appropriately, the decision made by the governing body is more likely in public interest. Note, I'm an Alaska resident for over 42 years, 20 of those years approximately an Anchorage resident. I'm trying to make my statement very simple. And what I have got to say is this. Number one is the exercise of giving the authority to the mayor in this issue. One should be very careful before you give that authority to any one individual, particularly the mayor. And what concerns also is the rush to make a decision that went for an introduction Thursday last week to be in a meeting. Time flies when I'm not having fun, but the end result is it's been fast-tracked. There's a few pages in here, and there was one work session on this. I remember the Wednesday where there was no chance for public to speak. I was in that room, sole member of the public. So with regard to this, there's also the issue is who are they trying to isolate? Remind you, a substantial number of people come to Anchorage. Does that mean someone from the valley coming into Anchorage, the mayor says, okay, him, her? Does that mean them? Anyone coming through the airport? Does that mean them? Whatever. But the fact is, the years I have been doing my job, I have witnessed the lack of careful thought among elected and bureaucrat officials, both in Anchorage State and the Valley. And now we're taking this direction here with, are you going to be better from before? And of so much importance and directing so much authority to one individual. And I'm trying to be calm, but because of all those years I've been doing what I'm doing, I'm more alarmed than anyone else, I believe, in this room, in the city, in the state, because of my awareness of what you all do and how you handle issues with respect. So I just hope for the best, but the practice of before hasn't shown good faith, giving faith and going forward on this thing. And the last thing I'm going to say in closing is this. The failure to have a conversation with the people, and this is showing here tonight as other meetings, but particularly here, the end result is these people are going to be less likely to comfortable with the decision, and they're going to be less supportive. But in this situation we're in right now, in closing, they're going to be more alarmed, and this is the way you're doing it.
Thank you. Your time has
alarm
expired.
And panic. Thank you.
Okay. Deputy Clerk, do we have anyone on the phone?
We're going to call Mr. Oliva.
Thank you. Hey, we no longer need 5 people. We have a quorum. We don't need.
We do. Suzanne can go.
You guys can go home if you like.
Hello.
Mr. Oliva, you're on with the Anchorage Assembly.
Yes.
Mr. Oliva, we are now discussing item 4C, an ordinance related to the mayor's emergency powers during a public health emergency. Do you have any testimony?
Yes, I do.
Go ahead.
This particular ordinance concerns me the greatest because of the track record of past crises where the mayor, especially with the homeless, declared a crisis, expanded the shelter without public really input following the ordinances, and just jumped through the hoops and declared it. And now this next one wasn't quite an earthquake, but we've done the same thing with just the reverse. You've overpopulated a homeless shelter and an overflow facility, and now because of the pandemic, you're moving them to either Ben Boeke or to Sullivan, kind of like the hurricane in New Orleans, but you couldn't get them out. And now, this is a concern also when you did the fire danger. You're giving the mayor a lot of power, but I don't think you're nipping it in the bud to constrain it. It just continues. And so no matter what you tell the public you're going to do, when the mayor declares it, then the rules go away. It's almost like martial law. And now you're going to have to call out the National Guard to get out into the homeless camps, because surely those are vulnerable, and if they get sick, how are you going to get them in? And they'll be the carriers of this disease. And just going by the shelter and beans, nothing is rapidly taking place. No one on site, no literature, no basic hygiene being followed. And it's obvious. So it's kind of scary to give the mayor the power, but not follow up and then have a reverse plan once the emergency is over. It just seems like it falls by the wayside, whether it be fire, the earthquake, the homeless crisis, and now this. We can plan to get through it, but once we're done, what are you going to do to bring it all back to normal? That's the big plan. And giving the mayor that power, I don't know, it's easier to keep going in the same wrong direction than it is to put a halt on it. So I would really look at the safety guards to the mayor and his power and how to put a sunset on it and go back the other direction to normalcy. Does anyone have any questions?
No, I don't see any questions. Thank you, Mr. Oliva.
Okay, and I want to let you know the mission is in lockdown. So if the mayor has that power to lock down the shelters, I wonder where the ACLU will be then.
Thank you, Mr. Oliva. All right,
You're welcome.
We're going to move on to our next caller.
Hi, Ms. Stampis. You're on with the Anchorage Assembly again.
Oh, great. Thank you very much.
Ms. Stampis, we're discussing 4C regarding the mayor's emergency powers during a public health emergency. Go ahead.
Great. Thank you. For the record, my name is Triada Stampis. I'm the Policy Director for the American Civil Liberties Union of Alaska. So thank you for the opportunity to provide testimony on this ordinance. My comments and written testimony that I submitted earlier today address the substitute version of the ordinance. And in that testimony, in the written testimony, I have detailed core principles and suggested areas for amendment of the ordinance to strike the appropriate balance between providing for public health and well-being while protecting civil liberties. History, unfortunately, teaches us that our government is most prone to committing abuses in times of crisis. And so we ask that you work to ensure that the emergency powers granted to the mayor are designed in such a way that they are not used or misused beyond their legitimate needs. I was listening into the work session that happened earlier this week and heard Assemblymember Constant rightly note that you legislate for all time and not just for today. And so I'm not going to go into details on my written testimony. It was fairly extensive, but wanted to make myself available should you have any questions. And thank you again for giving your attention to civil liberties issues in this time of pandemic and how we strike the right balance.
Thank you, Ms. Stampas. Your idea of being available, I think, is a little bit challenging, but we'll keep your phone number handy, I suppose, and if one of my colleagues wishes to have your specific views on a thought during debate, we'll call you back, if that's all right with you.
Thank you. Yes, thank you.
Okay. Actually, I do have a question for you from Ms. Zalatel, and then we've got one from Mr. Dyson as well. Ms. Zalatel?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to thank you for reaching out and giving us quite a considerable analysis. And I gave Ms. Stampas heads up earlier asking later that we maybe postpone action on this item so that we can have a full assessment from our municipal attorney staff. So again, thank you for the lengthy analysis, and I really appreciate the work.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Mr. Dyson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I appreciate your comments. I'm particularly interested in your comments here about folks challenging the mandatory orders. And part of what we have before us tonight includes some perhaps similar or criminal penalties for disobeying orders for quarantine and or reckless endangerment of others. How the heck should we handle these things and balance protecting public health and protecting individual rights?
Ms. Stampas, are you there?
Yes. I'm not sure that I understand the entirety of the question. You mentioned criminal sanctions. You've also mentioned balancing individual rights, and so it's not entirely clear that I can identify what the specific nut you're getting to.
Go ahead, Mr. Dyson.
Try to be simple. Somebody is tested positive and is supposed to be quarantined, and they disobey that and are out rubbing shoulders, so to speak, with the public, and perhaps being careless. What should be government's role in forcing them to not be endangering others, and how should that be practically challengeable?
Through the chair, I believe the ordinance grants the power to the mayor to mandate isolation or quarantine orders. And where we have weighed in is to ensure that due process rights continue to exist and that people have access to those rights and information about those rights when mandatory orders are put in place. So this does actually expand the powers of the mayor to mandate isolation or quarantine in a way that the mayor is not able to do at the moment. And if I read the ordinance correctly, also enables the mayor to use the police powers of government to enforce orders.
And you're okay with that?
Any mandatory quarantine or isolation orders should be scientifically justified and medically indicated, and ought to be able to be challenged via due process rights. So as long as those provisions are in place, it's hard for us to, this is an unprecedented moment that we find ourselves in, and so it's really hard to engage in hypotheticals and what ifs. What we can do at this moment is ensure that Core Civil Liberties principles continue to be reflected in the laws that we pass when we expand executive powers to act in emergencies.
I think he just said yes. And I
said we will not engage in hypotheticals.
I don't see how that applies at all, but thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Dyson. Thank you, Ms. Stampus. There are no further questions that I see. Let me double check. Yep, nothing here. Thank you, Ms. Stampus. We're going to disconnect the phone, but we will call you back if one of my members has questions during debate.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, so that, I think, brings us to the end of our public testimony. There is, to remind folks, there is also testimony in the AIM that has been submitted along with this agenda that we collected via email prior to this meeting. With that, seeing no one else, public testimony is now closed. What is the will of the body?
Move to approve.
Moved and seconded. Debate. We'll start with Mr. Weddleton.
I'd like to move Weddleton Amendment Number 1.
Do we have a second?
Second.
Moved by Mr. Weddleton, seconded by Ms. LaFrance. Go ahead, Mr. Weddleton.
This one has 3 parts, and actually you just heard from Ms. Stampus on about all of them. And we broke it up. If you don't like pieces of it, perhaps we could bifurcate it. But the first one basically agrees with the thought that any restrictions on liberty must be scientifically justified and be least restrictive measures available to protect public health. And this amendment explicitly requires the public health emergency to be grounded on the recommendations of public health experts. So this is the first one, number 1A. In the section that defines public health emergency adds that instead of saying is believed to be caused, it would say has been identified by the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, State of Alaska Department of Health and Social Services, or Anchorage Health Department to be caused by any of the following, and then continues as it was. 1B, again, follows that any government restrictions on liberty must be the least restrictive measures available to protect public health. This amendment applies that standard throughout all actions authorized by the new section, and it does that at the end on Section 2, page 2 at line 49, adds the words, the actions taken should be the least restrictive measure available to meet the goals of protecting public health. Now, this makes it very explicit in this section, but there are several other places throughout the document that do say that the actions would be the least restrictive measures. So this really just brings that kind of a little earlier in the whole section to make it clear that that's the case. Part 1C of this amendment, again, is any government restrictions on liberty must be continually reevaluated to ensure they remain justified in light of scientific evidence as conditions evolve. So if you look at Part 1C of this, it actually broke up a section a little bit, so it's more sensible divisions. So you get a new Part B, and then Part C goes from tracking to tracking and reporting. And at the end of the paragraph adds, regular reports to the Assembly are required to allow continuous evaluation of the need for the emergency proclamation and the actions taken under this section. We've done that quite a lot lately, is asked for various reports on things that the administration has done, and this just continues that. And I think in the case of this pandemic, we've been getting very good information from the administration. It's been very helpful, and this just puts it out there that that's needed. We have, I believe for Tuesday, an ordinance that would let us actually address individual actions within an emergency situation. So that would tie in with this, where if we get a report that some part of the emergency, some action taken could end or was inappropriate, we would, through resolution, be able to end it without ending the whole emergency proclamation. So the way this is worded goes hand in hand with something we'll be looking at soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Weddleton. Is there any discussion on Mr. Weddleton's amendment? Mr. Gates.
Not exactly about the amendment, but I have corresponded with the municipal attorney, Mrs. Vogel, and she has expressed a strong preference that this be postponed till Tuesday when she could be here to speak to the substance of the amendments and the ordinance. She has a preference to postpone the amendments till Tuesday night as well. And I just wanted to deliver her message to you.
Okay. I know we have a desire from Ms. Zalatel to postpone as well. I had hoped to get through these amendments because I do not believe, given the difficulty we will have getting through public testimony on Tuesday, that we will get to every ordinance. We will try to put this early on the agenda, but I think there's a good chance that if we have to go through all these amendments on Tuesday night, that we might not get through our work. But that being said, she's not here. No other representative is here. Would anyone else like to make a motion to postpone?
Move to postpone.
Mr. Chair, second.
Moved by Mr. Weddleton, seconded by Ms. Zalatel. Mr. Constant, you're in the queue. Speaking to the motion to postpone.
Yeah, I think it's better sport to have everyone in the room. So I'm fine with amending. Wouldn't this fall under the items at the 11A on the agenda? Because it's we've done public hearing, it's closed as a continued item.
Which is
It'd be
11 through
section 11.
Okay.
It'd be early, so we'd get to it.
Okay. Good. For the movers, can we clarify that we move the S version? Who were the movers in?
Yes, the S version.
Mr. Weldon and Mr. Peterson. Mr. Peterson was the S version. He is shaking his head yes. Okay, Mr. Dyson, speaking to the motion to postpone.
Yeah, I think I agree with you, Mr. Chair, that, and I'm channeling Eugene here, but the closer we had this item to what the probable final product is could be, the better informed the population would be. And some of these things, most of them actually make it better. Mine is kind of controversial, perhaps, and so on and so forth. So I'm fine with postponing, but I wanted to say I support what you wanted to do to get as much work done and get the public kind of spun up to the direction we're heading here.
Thank you, Mr. Dyson. Ms. Zalatel?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would just like to give the municipal attorney's office a chance to digest the amendments as well as the comments from the ACLU. I think it's important because we want to look at this ordinance not just now, but in the context of other things that could occur. And I believe that the ACLU raised some interesting points that we should fully take into consideration. So I fully support postponement until Tuesday. And it'll be early enough in the agenda, I think we'll be able to get to it.
Thank you, Ms. Zalatel. Is there any other discussion on this motion to postpone? I'm not seeing anything from my colleagues on the phone. I don't see anything from my colleagues here. All right, please vote on the motion to postpone. So we'll start with folks in the room.
Could I please, I believe it was Mr. Weddleton and Ms. Zalatel that
Yeah.
seconded, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Please vote. Okay. Madam Clerk.
Ms. Zalatel on the motion to postpone? Ms. Kennedy?
Yeah.
Mr. Rivera?
Yes.
Ms. Quinn Davidson?
Yes.
Mr. Perez Verdilla?
I vote yes.
Thank you. That item, that motion rather, let's see here. It's not up on the screen.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay. What was the vote count there?
11-0.
Okay, that motion passed unanimously. We'll take that back up on the 24th. At this time, on the agenda, we've come to item 5A. We're going to need a motion to introduce this. This is ordinance number AO 2020-41, an ordinance amending Anchorage Municipal Code, Chapter 3.80, Civil Emergency, to allow the Assembly to terminate individual emergency regulations or orders without terminating the period of emergency. From the Department of Law, with the public hearing set for now for the 14th of April, although I believe I might be calling a special meeting for this. Can we get a motion, a second, and a third to introduce?
Move to introduce.
If I might, before we get there, if we set a public hearing for a certain date, are we bound to that? And that would raise the question, if we're bound to that, should we just schedule that special meeting to address this, as opposed to set it for mid-April and then find that we can't change the date?
Madam Clerk, are we bound, if we set the public hearing at this time, are we bound to not change it?
Through the chair, you could do it later, but you would have some difficulty doing it earlier.
That's a good point. Okay. Well,
and I just would offer, Mr. Chair, that this was a very valuable proposal made by the administration to assure the public and us as a body that we aren't bound by an impossible vote.
Thank you, Mr. Constant. Given that it is being introduced tonight, what is the earliest date at which we could have a special meeting?
Mr. Chair, if I might, I would recommend that we set a special meeting for March the 31st at a time we already have reserved.
One moment, Mr. Constant.
Mr. Chair, by my count, I believe the earliest that you could have would be March 30th. And I'd like Mr. Gates to double check me on that, please.
Seward's Day.
Oh, he's giving us the thumbs up.
Because we can't have it on a weekend? Is that the issue?
Well, you can't start counting on the weekend because you've introduced it today. We need to publicly notice it. Public notice won't start until Monday.
Very good. Given those facts, there's no appreciable difference really between the 30th and the 31st. The 31st is the Tuesday, that's traditional time, and as Mr. Constant has rightly pointed out, we already have a scheduled idea of taking up some action by the administration at that time. That is the continuation of one of their executive orders. So I'm going to propose that we schedule a special meeting on the 31st and that we set public hearing to that date. What kind of motions do we need for that, Madam Clerk?
So, Mr. Chair, setting a public hearing is something that you can direct the clerk to do. So I think you could do a motion to introduce, and set the public hearing for March 31st.
Mr. Chair, I would move to introduce this item and set for public hearing March 31st.
Thank you, Mr. Constant. Can I have a second?
Third.
Seconded by Mr. Peterson, thirded by Ms. LaFrance. Thank you, Mr. Constant. That was a very good catch. Okay, so that item has been set for public hearing on the 31st, and I will be calling a special meeting on that date.
Mr. Chair, we have one other little cleanup item that we need to do.
Yeah.
Could you just please confirm that you closed the public hearing on 4C?
Yeah, I want to confirm for the clerk that I did close the public hearing on item 4C.
Maybe hit that gavel for fun.
Maybe we want to extend it.
Maybe we don't.
We can reopen it then if we
Yeah, we can reopen it if need be.
A lot of amendments.
There are a lot of amendments, that's true. Okay, we are now on item 6A, resolution number AR 2020-88, a resolution of the Anchorage Assembly calling for a community response to mitigate the social and economic impacts of COVID-19. Assembly members Rivera and Quinn Davidson. There is a late on the table item, which is an S version. What is the will of the body?
Did we introduce it?
I'm sorry. No, so it's been introduced.
Okay, move to approve.
Yeah. So moved.
The S version.
Moved. The S version has been moved to approval by Mr. Constant. Is there a second?
Second.
Seconded by, was that Mr. Rivera or Mr. Perez-Revilla?
Mr. Rivera.
Thank you, Mr. Rivera. Okay. So moved and seconded. Discussion on this item.
Mr. Chair, I'd like to move amendment number 2.
I'm sorry, who is that?
Ms. Alatel.
Second.
Ms. Alatel is moving amendment number 2. I apologize, I need to find the amendments to this item. Would you please explain the amendment, Ms. Alatel?
Sure, Mr. Chair. This does 2 things primarily. It's under the request to the state, says require all state employees who are able to work from home. Similarly, with regard to municipal businesses, it says require all employees who are able to work from home. And then additionally, and this amendment was drafted before the recent announcement, but it's consistent, restrict all non-essential air travel to and from Alaska and within the state.
Thank you, Ms. Zalatel. And some folks have pointed out to me that it's actually amendment number 1 in our packet. You're referring right to a Zalatel Constant amendment number 1?
Yes, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you. All right, any other discussion on this amendment? By the way, who was the second on that?
I was.
Oh, Mr. Constant was. Mr. Weddleton?
You know, given that we're shutting down businesses and doing all this stuff, it seems like this whole thing is so harsh on so many people that maybe this is needed. But you know, there are so many work environments. I mean, there could very well be people who can go to an office that is secluded from anywhere else, and it's probably the most safe for them to be. So to require them to work at home, and working at home may be a bad place to be if someone's quarantined at their house. I mean, I think this locks it into probably more than we should.
Thank you, Mr. Weddleton. Mr. Constant?
Thank you. You know, I think I would agree in the past, but I have heard from a number of friends who work in state office buildings and cubicles in contained environments that are recirculating air, and they're really scared. And I've spoken with the state office public employee unions. They've been appealing to the governor to let their workers go home, and they haven't been able to figure out a way. And I'm going to stand with the workers in this and say that we need to support them in their message that they deserve to be safe, that our whole community deserves to be safe.
Thank you, Mr. Constant. Mr. Dyson?
Yeah. So I'm slow.
Mr. Dyson, if you could speak closely to the mic because of people online.
Yeah, so I'm slow at digesting this. So I'm fine with the intent, but who's going to decide what is essential air travel within the state? There's lots of folks who are stranded here in Anchorage and want to get back to their homes in the bush. It's not essential that they do that. There's rooms that they can rent here to stay, but they're away from family, away from their responsibilities and so on. And there's worry about that. I'd be glad to have somebody explain to me what this really means, or how we should think about this, or how we can take it from being badly arbitrary.
Mr. Chair.
Yeah, Mr. Constant.
Thank you. All of this is a strongly worded letter to the governor. We don't have any of these powers. And so everything that we're putting on this list are requests we're making for them to consider in their proceedings. And so for our part, we're communicating to the governor's office that we believe it would be best for them to come up with a solution that limits the interstate travel. So I believe they would be the ones tasked with coming up with the bounds of that decision.
If I may respond, when we put the word essential in there, that has some meaning to us. If it said in the way that best protects public health and allows important transportation to go forward, yeah, I'm sorry, I can't express my reservations very well.
Thank you, Mr. Dyson. Ms. Zolotel, you wanted to speak?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. To Mr. Dyson, I think that is consistent with the governor's most recent order. I'm trying to find the language now, but not coming up with it fast enough. And as to Mr. Weddleton's point, I would say, I've been contacted by quite a few privately employed individuals who are worried that they are not being given really the opportunity to work from home. It's either an offer that feels like it has negative consequences, or it's just not happening. And so I think making a strong statement that if it's possible and it can happen, then that makes total sense. But if someone does have those specific circumstances, I hear that, but we're really, and in conjunction with, quite honestly, the mayor's recent order, keeping people at home is really the safest thing to do in most circumstances. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Zolotel. Mr. Weddleton, do you want to speak to that?
I'm baffled by the notion I will stand with labor and go with this. It's kind of could go either way. I mean, to make this like a anti-labor thing to say they have choice, I'm baffled by, but I'll let it go.
Okay. Thank you.
No.
Okay.
Well, it is. Sorry.
Mr. Dyson.
Yeah, I don't want to sound pejorative, but this whole work from home thing, it seems to me that comes from people who sit at a darn desk. There are tens of thousands of people who drive trucks, have tools in their hands, move things with forklifts or whatever, and the work from home thing just doesn't make any sense. So I just encourage you all, in spite of the environment you've spent most of your lives in, there are people out there that pick up tools and drive machinery and do all kinds of things that can any way can be considered with it. And also, of course, I'm sure none of you are thinking that our public health and public safety people should work from home. The whole thing is, I'm sorry. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Dyson. Okay. Any other discussion on this amendment? All right, not seeing any, please vote on this amendment.
Ms. Zolotel?
Yes.
Ms. Kennedy?
No.
Mr. Rivera?
Yes.
Ms. LaFrance? Oh, sorry.
Hologram.
Ms. LaFrance and Mr. Peterson haven't voted yet.
Quinn Davidson.
Ms. Quinn Davidson?
Yes.
Mr. Perez Verdilla?
Yes.
Oh, Jennifer needs to switch that, sorry. The vote was...
That amendment passes 8-2. Who didn't vote?
Mr. Perez Verdilla's vote wasn't recorded, and he voted yes.
Okay, that item passes 9-2. Let's see here. Mr. Rivera, you asked to be in the queue? And okay. Yeah, Mr. Rivera, you asked to be in the queue?
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Last week, several constituents reached out to me to ask what we, the Assembly specifically, were doing about economic impacts related to the growing threat of COVID-19 around the world. I hadn't realized that cities in the lower 48 were taking action and was led to a resolution that was passed by the Philadelphia City Council that is similar to what we have before us today. That led me to further research over the weekend, and on Monday, when we all heard about the mayor's first emergency order, now we're on emergency order number 3, engaged into Warp Drive and joined Ms. Quinn Davidson in these efforts. So in quick fashion, Ms. Quinn Davidson and I reached out to the following organizations to get their input after we put together a draft on Tuesday, and others reached out to us from Tuesday to Thursday, including, we heard from Alaska Char, Alaska Hospitality Retailers, Alaska Board of Realtors, Anchorage Chamber of Commerce, Anchorage Economic Development Corporation, our 2 biggest landlords, Mr. Widener and Mayor Maestrom, Cook Inlet Housing Authority, the Landlords Almanac, which is a group of small-scale landlords, Alaska Bankers Association, the Alaska Poor People's Campaign, Alaska Public Interest Research Group, Homelessness Resource Advisory Council, Car Safeway, GCI, Chugach Electric, NSTAR, ACS, O'Malley Ice and Sports Center, LLC, the chair of the Budget Advisory Commission, members of the state legislature, and through them, the governor's office, and the administration. All but 2 of those listed provided feedback, and we also received feedback from dozens of individuals via email, over the phone, and on social media after we began posting about them on Monday. Although it may be unusual for us to consider a resolution like this in such a short time frame, I would urge my colleagues to take action tonight. Our constituents are looking for us for leadership, bold action, and to ensure that we are going to take the ramifications of this public health emergency seriously. I believe this resolution is a great start and sends a strong message that we are doing this the Alaskan way, as the mayor and governor have said multiple times in the past week. We've all done an excellent job as a community working together, and this resolution is crafted in that spirit, asking us to work together on the issues listed, especially because we don't have control over most of the issues listed, which I have reiterated repeatedly from beginning to anyone that has asked me about our efforts. Ms. Quinn Davidson and I are happy to entertain any additional amendments folks have, but again, we urge and hope everyone understands the importance of us taking action and passing this tonight. With that, Mr. Chair, I'd like to see if Ms. Quinn Davidson has anything to add. Otherwise, the 2 of us do have a few amendments of our own.
Okay, I have Mr. Weddleton, Mr. Constant in the queue. Let's see here. You have amendments. Do we have copies of those amendments?
No, these are verbal amendments. They're fairly straightforward.
Okay. Mr. Weddleton, Mr. Constant, do you want to speak before or after the amendments?
Mine is very lighthearted.
Okay.
Well, I don't know. I'll speak now, and then we'll see. I think it's very clear that a lot of people are talked to in this because there's something in here for everyone, and that becomes a challenge too because it's not really priorities, it's not really leadership. It just says go every direction and go there fast. And some of these are very contradictory. I mean, some of these it just doesn't make sense. Maybe we can patch it up if we work on it for a while here. I mean, one example is in Section 1, the municipal administration to request that industries which require close physical contact shut down operations during this public health emergency. And I guess that means doctors and public health facilities would close because they do close physical contact. And I know you don't mean that, but that's what you say here. So that should probably just be deleted. And I think in C, in Section 2, for the legislature, expand the definition of employer in the Alaska Family Leave Act. So I'm guessing you would say for businesses under 50 that they should be paying their employees for the time they're off work. And at the time we've shut down those businesses, I don't see how that's going to work. I mean, there aren't a whole lot that can continue to pay their employees
I think
when they're not working. I mean, there's just so many things in here that.
John, I think that's actually now, not C. Are you looking
Oh,
at the
it's
S
D, I'm
version?
sorry, yeah, D.
Okay.
Thank you. So I mean, this is something for everybody, but it doesn't smack of leadership to me. It smacks of a kind of a fruit salad, you know, it's got something in there. It kind of seems tasty, but it's not leadership. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Weddleton. Mr. Constant.
I just wanted to say thank you to the drafters. This was a surprise to me. It was drafted in all these meetings that happened, and I'd never heard a word about it. So I was surprised that it was drafted so thoroughly in such a short amount of time. Very impressive effort.
Thank you, Mr. Constant. So there's no one else in the queue. Mr. Rivera or Ms. Quinn Davidson, you said you have some amendments to make?
Mr. Chair, I'm going to, first I want to see if Ms. Quinn Davidson has anything that she wants to add from what I said, and then we can go into amendments.
Okay.
Thanks, Mr. Rivera. I don't. I think you covered it well. I do think that Mr. Weddleton's comment on 1F makes some sense, so we could entertain changing that slightly. And thank you, Mr. Constant, for the comments. We've been working a lot to get this out. So I'll let you go ahead, Felix.
Thanks, Ms. Quinn Davidson. So first, I just want to say I'm slightly disappointed by Mr. Weddleton's comments. This is something that our constituents are urging us to do. They are urging us to take swift action. They're urging us to look at practically everything under the sun, and I think this is a good suite of action. If you look at what's happened in the last week, actually several of these things have already happened in the last week, and it continues to evolve. So I think you may not, well, you don't agree with me, Mr. Weddleton, but this is us raising our voice and being leaders. So in regards specifically to 1C, this was a request that was brought forward by a massage therapist who essentially was unable to stop working. Their employer stated until they hear from the state or the city that they are required to keep coming to work. And multiple employees want to stay home. They don't want to go to work because of this public health emergency. So with regards to that specific section, if potentially the one amendment that could be made is adding non-essential into there, so that would ensure that those essential would be able to actually continue doing their job. And apologies, yes, I'm at 1F here. So I move an amendment that adds non-essential in front of industries on 1F. So request that non-essential industries which require close physical contact, etc.
Okay, so I'm sorry, who was the second?
Yes, Ms. Zalatel.
So moved by Mr. Rivera, seconded by Ms. Zalatel, adding the word non-essential in front of industries on line 28, that's section 1F. Any discussion on that proposed amendment? Ms. Quinn Davidson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That language is repeated in 2K. I'm seeing if we put it in the other. I think that's the only place it's repeated, but I just would want to add that same non-essential language there.
You would?
Yes.
Okay, so will the mover and the seconder agree that that amendment also applies to section 27K?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Any other discussion on this amendment? Okay. Please vote on this amendment.
Ms. Zalatel?
Yes.
Ms. Kennedy?
Yes.
Mr. Rivera?
Yes.
Ms. Quinn Davidson?
Yes.
Mr. Perez Verdia?
Yes.
That amendment passes 11-0. We are now back to the original resolution as amended. Would anyone else like to propose an amendment or discuss this item?
Mr. Chair.
Mr. Rivera.
Thank you. So I move to amend page 2 to replace the entire 1A section starting on line 10. There's been several additions made into here, and having a full rewording of it is going to be helpful. So once I get a second, well, I'll just repeat it twice, and then we can do a second. So,
hold on. Could we? Maybe could you if you have an entire rewrite of a section, could you email that to the clerk and we can put it up on the screen?
Sure.
Okay.
Doing that right now.
All right. While he's doing that, does anyone else have an amendment to offer? Okay, we're going to take a brief at ease and allow that to happen, and we'll put that up on the screen.
Mr. Chair,
Yes.
I would just request that if we could see that through an email as well, because
Good point.
we have the advantage of seeing anything on a screen there. So if that could be emailed,
Yes.
that'd be great. Thanks.
Very good. So, Madam Clerk or Deputy Clerk, could you please also email that to our colleagues?
Yes.
Changes. So, Mr. Rivera, do you want to walk us through this amendment?
Sure. So this amendment is to replace the current 1A on page 2, starting on line 10, just to add additional language suggested from the Housing Authority. So I'll just read it. Understanding that the federal government issued a 60-day moratorium on evictions and foreclosures for homeowners with FHA-insured mortgages, explore and support temporary moratoriums or mitigation actions for people who are unable to pay real property tax penalties or faced with evictions or foreclosures due to a short-term inability to pay, except for those who would be evicted for safety, property damage, or gross nuisance purposes, period.
Okay, so you're just moving that? The other two are separate? That's.
I could do all three, sure. Might as well just do them in one amendment.
Why don't we, you know what, they're so distinct that why don't we just do that one first, okay? So that'll be one amendment. Can I get a second to that?
Second.
Was that Ms. Zolotel?
Yes.
Okay. Seconded by Ms. Zolotel. Discussions on this particular amendment, just section 1, on page 2, section 1A.
Yeah.
Mr. Dyson.
Yeah, sorry, grammar's not my thing. Maybe this got covered, but in that first sentence is understanding that on the federal government. I don't know what the word, how on fits in there.
Yeah, Mr. Rivera?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, that was a grammatical error, so on should be deleted.
Okay. Does the second agree to that?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Dyson. Channeling Mr. Weddleton. Ms. LaFrance.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. On that first point, where it says the municipal administration, or I guess backing up, resolve that the Anchorage Assembly calls upon the municipal administration to understanding that the federal government just suspended evictions. It's a little bit, I mean, I understand what it's saying, but verb agreement doesn't really work there.
That's true.
If I might, Mr. Chair, I would like to move that we also postpone and take this up on Tuesday after we're able to create an S version that addresses all of these concerns and gives us a chance to read for clarity and just take a breath, because we're making sausage now.
Okay, would anyone else like to speak to that motion to postpone this item until Tuesday?
You need a second?
Yeah, so that was seconded by Ms. Zolotel. Discussion on the motion to postpone.
Nope, that was Ms. Kennedy.
Oh, I'm sorry, Ms. Kennedy. My apologies.
Thank you.
Mr. Dyson, on the motion to postpone?
Yeah, I'm in favor of it as well. I'd like to make a suggestion to the sponsors. This is something else to think about. So when we get done with this vote, would you let me have that chance?
Yes. You might have to flag me down again because I'm getting a lot of requests to be in the queue. Let's see, who's next? I have Ms. Quinn Davidson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm opposed to the motion to continue this. We've been working really hard to try to get everything together in a timely way, and as you all know, by the day, things change. I mean, really by the hour. And so I suspect some of this will be completely outdated by Tuesday, whether because it's passed and we're already moving forward with the state and federal government, or because we've shifted some gear. And I think now's the time to do it. Truthfully, these amendments are just to make small changes that Felix proposed. We could pass it without those amendments. They're just grammar changes, and if it's not perfect, I think that's okay, because the purpose is to respond to our constituents. And, you know, when Mr. Weddleton said this isn't leadership, this is something for everyone, leadership can be something for everyone, because our job is to represent all of our constituents and to look at what's paining all of them. And right now we're all in this together. And so I think now is the time to do this. I think postponing it would just drastically change the whole point of doing it.
Thank you, Ms. Quinn Davidson. Ms. Kennedy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would appreciate us postponing this simply because I do think, well, first of all, when I look at this, this is a huge laundry list of items that we think somebody else other than us should be looking at and doing. And I am kind of disturbed by the fact that there are certain things, some things on here that are really demands and directives. And I appreciate when they say things like explore this or consider that, or even using the word request. Some of these are pretty much, they're demands. And just for the reasons that Ms. Quinn Davidson said about how things are changing on a regular basis, that makes this, even to a certain extent, we could pass it, and by Monday morning when somebody gets the chance to look at it, most of it could be obsolete. And I think, too, that a lot of what's on here are things that we know these different organizations are already considering. So I think if we want to do something, we should take the time to really look at what is our part. What can we do? What are we going to promise people, or at least tell people that we're going to assist with? I think that would be much more valuable in terms of trying to tell the public what our role is and how we're trying to help in this. I think we ought to really put more of the onus on ourselves in terms of what we'd like to do. So if we can postpone till Tuesday to maybe reconsider that a little bit better, then I think there would be more value to this resolution. Otherwise, I can see a number of entities looking at this list and going, oh, thank you very much, and then just set it aside, because it won't mean anything to them. So postponing might give us a chance to actually focus this into something that would be maybe useful. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Kennedy. Mr. Rivera, you're in the queue.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I am strongly opposed to the motion to postpone. One grammatical error does not ground to postpone. We can easily fix that. And in terms of immediacy, we already heard that the state is moving forward with a $1 billion plan. The legislature, I've talked with members of the legislature, they are moving forward with different actions. The federal government over the weekend is going to be working on issues, and on Monday might come up with some additional actions in Congress. So why wouldn't we want to get this in the hands of our federal delegation as soon as possible? The fact is, we don't know who is considering what. And we should, as leaders in our city, be clear about what we want folks to consider. And every single organization that I listed above had some suggestions, understands that there is clarity in this for them. No one that I talked to of all of those organizations was unclear about the requests being made of them. Lastly, I will state that that Ms. Quinn Davidson and I have been working very closely with the administration on this since Monday, and they have an economic task force that they have put together. Why wouldn't we want to give them our thoughts as soon as possible? So for all of those reasons and more, I strongly urge a no vote on this motion to postpone. There are few issues that we can tackle today, and let's actually get this approved and actually have a voice in this issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rivera. Would anyone else like to speak on the motion to postpone? Okay, not seeing any. Please vote on the motion to postpone.
Ms. Salatel?
No.
Ms. Kennedy?
Yes.
Mr. Rivera?
No.
Ms. Quinn Davidson?
No.
Mr. Perez Verdilla?
No.
Sorry. The motion, it goes away.
The motion failed 5-6. So now we are back to the amendment proposed by Mr. Rivera related to changing the section 1A. Is there any further discussion? We were talking about verb agreement. Is there any further discussion on 1A or this amendment?
Mr. Chair, if the second agrees, I believe there's a quick fix to fix the issue that Ms. LaFrance had.
Okay.
which is to add that first clause all the way through the first comma. So understanding that yada yada through 2020. Add that after what we're actually asking, which is to explore and support temporary moratoriums or mitigation actions. And give me 2 seconds.
Yeah, I think I understand what you're saying here. You just want to reverse the two clauses. So you start with explore, to explore and support temporary through gross nuisance purposes, and then add understanding that the federal government issued a 60-day moratorium. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. Mr. Sherwood, you're in the queue.
I just had a simpler fix, I think, which would, so it would read the municipal administration to understand and go on with that, and after 2020, put the word "and" in.
You know what? That actually, that makes sense to me.
What did you say, Mr. Rivera?
That works for me.
Okay. So does a second agree to the proposed solution by Mr. Sherwood?
Yes.
Okay. So it would now read, to understand that the federal government issued a 60-day moratorium on evictions and foreclosures for homeowners with FHA-insured mortgages, and explore and support temporary moratoriums, etc. Did you catch that, Madam Clerk? I did. Okay. So we've got that. Any further discussion on this item? I'm sorry, on this amendment. Madam Clerk, do you have that entered? Okay. Please vote on that amendment.
Ms. Salatel?
Yes.
Ms. Kennedy?
Yes.
Mr. Rivera?
Yes.
Ms. Quinn Davidson?
Yes.
Mr. Perez Verdilla?
Yes.
That amendment passes unanimously. Mr. Rivera, do you want to offer these last two amendments?
So I do want to offer amendment number 2.
Okay.
Which is to duplicate item 3F under the section to the federal delegation under the state section. So creating a new, I believe it's an M on page 3, line 32 with the same language, but replacing federal with state. And I can do the whole amendment if the clerk needs it.
Do you got that, Madam Clerk?
I think I'm close.
Two, okay. Do we have a second for that amendment? Don't everyone speak up at once.
Oh, I'll second. Awesome.
Okay. All right. Moved by Mr. Rivera, seconded by Ms. Quinn Davidson. Mr. Dyson on the amendment.
Yeah, thank you. Does your definition of nonprofits or your intention here include things like Catholic Social Services, Brother Francis Shelter, all kinds of things like that?
Mr. Chair, if I may.
Yes.
Those are all nonprofit organizations, and so yes, they would be included in this general statement.
Yeah, so, all right. Yeah, because you called out daycare facilities, which is certainly important, but nothing like some of the other services. It made me question. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Dyson. Any other discussion on this amendment? Seeing none, please vote on this amendment.
Ms. Salatel?
Yes.
Ms. Kennedy?
Yes.
Mr. Rivera?
Yes.
Ms. Quinn Davidson?
Yes.
Mr. Perez Verdilla?
Yes.
That item passes, I'm sorry, that amendment passes unanimously. Mr. Rivera, do you have any other further amendments to offer?
I will not offer amendment number 3, but would like to briefly speak to the intent.
Okay.
So, thank you, Mr. Chair. So, I have heard both from the federal government, state government, local government, a lot of concerns regarding small businesses and large businesses and a variety of different sectors. But what's been suspiciously quiet is any discussion around homelessness. I applaud the administration for the efforts that they have taken on homelessness. I think we are a shining leader and example in that area. So this amendment wasn't an attempt to highlight that this is a serious issue, that there are extreme concerns in the community, and that just based on all the reading that I have done, there are nationally concerns that the population experiencing homelessness is going to be left out of most of our relief efforts and are going to suffer exponentially compared to other but this time, though, I will not offer the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Rivera. Are there any further amendments? Okay, we'll go back to discussing the main item. Mr. Dyson, you had asked to be in the queue. Mr. Dyson.
Yeah, thank you. Two subjects. Mr. Wellison's comment about showing leadership. I have 26 years of seeing the lack of much effectiveness from resolutions. Not that we shouldn't do that. It's our way of stating opinions, but I would have recommended that this show our priorities. And I just quickly jotted down, if I was doing that, what would be the first thing? Well, certainly prevention, then treatment, and then getting essential stuff to people, food, medicine, masks, whatever. And then all the immediate personal things and for the homeless is a great example. There's people that may be out of food tonight and shelter tonight, but families, child care people can't work and that kind of thing. And then immediate financial relief. That's people that are literally almost living week by week or hand to mouth and so on. Those are the ones that need money quick. And then midterm financial stuff. Those people that lose their business or lose their house or their car gets repossessed. And then long-term financial. But Felix, one thing that I haven't seen any bring up, and that's asking the federal government to defer by 3 months the IRS payments that are due in the middle of next month. And what a grand idea! And that one would help the poorest, upper middle, lower middle class people immediately. Did anybody even think about that, Felix?
Mr. Chair?
Yeah, Mr. Constant, I apologize. I'm trying to manage some stuff here. Mr. Constant?
For your edification, the federal government is faster than all of us. They extended to July 15th the filing deadline for the tax bills this year.
That is the first time the federal government's been ahead of me in 80 years.
Just today it happened.
All right, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Rivera.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. To Mr. Dyson, yes, that was considered, and in fact, Davidson and I shopped an idea with the administration specifically around this, but there were concerns from Treasury and Office of Management and Budget, which I assume they're not there today, specifically regarding the impact deferred property tax payments would have to our credit rating and payment to our debt. And so that is why we did a general statement regarding property tax relief, if that's what you were referring to. I'm not sure if you were referring to that or to federal tax.
Yeah, I was talking about the federal.
Mr. Rivera, any follow-up?
Thank you. So Mr. Constant addressed that perfectly then.
Okay. Mr. Constant, you're in the queue.
That was just to enlighten Mr. Dyson that he and the federal government are on the same wavelength.
For once.
Okay. Is there any other discussion on this item? Okay. Please vote on this resolution. Oh, sorry.
Ms. Zalatel?
Yes.
Ms. Kennedy?
Yes.
Mr. Rivera?
Yes.
Ms. Quinn Davidson?
Yes.
Mr. Perez Verdia?
Yes.
Item passes 10-1. Okay. Okay. Well, that item passes. Let's see where we are on our agenda. All right. We have time now for audience participation.
Mr. Chair, before we do that, did we introduce the items that needed to be introduced? I don't
Yes.
remember taking that vote. Okay.
There was only one item that was going to be introduced tonight. Is that correct?
That is correct.
I just want to make sure we did everything we need to.
Constant
Yep.
introduced it, Mr.
Yep.
Peterson was the second, and Ms. LaFrance was the third.
Thanks.
And the public hearing is set for March 31st.
Yep. Okay. So we're now down to audience participation. Is there anyone who'd like to participate? Okay.
My name is Eugene Carl-Haberman. I live in the Matsuo Valley. I follow the public process. When the public process is done appropriately, a decision made by the governing body is more likely in the public interest. One thing that stands out is this item that was laid on the table that you just voted on it, resolution. No chance for the public to be engaged. It was new to you, too, at this meeting because it was laid on the table. And you voted down the opportunity for it to be continued and have it on Tuesday. But even if you did that, you were talking about a redraft, and that would have been laid on the table because it's too late for an addendum to the agenda because this is Friday night. So, more of the same. A message to the press. I believe in the freedom of the press. I believe they have a right sometimes not to report what I say. But when there's a public hearing and they only report what the politicians and bureaucrats say, they violate balanced journalism. So what I'm pleading with the press is you are partner in this lack of conversation. The conversation I witnessed on these items tonight is a continued pattern in which you report what the politicians and bureaucrats say. And the problem also with this, now we are in a world health crisis. Respect, yes, your members of the Assembly and administration, but the fact is you failed miserably to have an appropriate conversation. You made decisions tonight that showed the public who was not here that you are here and they're there and they don't have a fair chance. I remind you there are a lot of people, not just in this room, but across Anchorage Valley in the state and outside this country. They're all concerned with what's going on. But the failure to have appropriate conversation with the people, it's one-sided. The end result is your decision is less likely going to be the public interest, and it creates a situation where the public now is more concerned of what's going on because they've not been party to that conversation. It's more vital to have it now than ever before. So, with all due respect, it only distressed me, and the fact is, I got 50 seconds to be left, but I'd like to remind you, too, is you have an opportunity to vote for reconsideration on those three items tonight. You can do it tonight and tomorrow. You need to do that because what has happened here is you can't escape what you've done here unless you reconsider the matter and connect with the people. And also, this is the last thing to say. For those who were not at that meeting, I was a sole member of the public at that so-called work session. But Assembly Dunbar had mentioned that Wednesday meeting, and Assembly members on the phone, this remark is that we need to get to that first item about being on the phone. Then we vote on that, that comes immediate effect, and then we can leave the meeting. That's the words that came out of that meeting Wednesday. So, Mayor, I wish you good luck, but you need to have a partnership in here. And also, a footnote, my name is Eugene Carl Haberman, phone number 907-632-9449, email eugene@mtaonline.net.
Yep, thank you. Oh, there we go. Okay. So, is there anyone else in the audience who'd like to participate? All right, we will move down to member comments. We'll start with the folks on the phone. Madam Clerk, could you read their names, please?
Yes, Mr. Chair. Ms. Selatel.
No comment, thank you.
Ms. Kennedy.
I just hope everybody stays safe and practices what we're preaching. So thank you.
Mr. Rivera.
Thank you. So just a couple quick notes. First, just want to say that we did send this resolution to the press. It was sent a couple days ago, and we've sent updated versions to them. And the resolution and all of the discussions that we've been having have reverberated time and time again on social media. And I think now more than ever, we should be engaging as much as we can in digital platforms because that's where the people are at right now. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rivera.
Ms. Quinn Davidson.
None for me. Thank you all for being here tonight.
Thank you.
Mr. Perez Verdia.
Just a big thanks to everybody for working through the issues tonight and for sticking with it. And stay safe and healthy. And have a good night. That's it. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Perez Verdia. Is that everyone on the phone? Okay, we'll go down the aisle here. We'll start our dais. We'll start with Ms. LaFrance.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My thanks to the clerk's office and members of the staff and administration for being here tonight, and definitely unprecedented times. Thanks.
Thank you, Ms. LaFrance. Mr. Peterson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I encourage people to try to catch the first two-thirds of the mayor's announcement that we missed earlier so we can figure out exactly what all he did say. And also, if you were sending that resolution to the press earlier this week, it sure would have been great if the rest of us could have got a draft at that same time. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Peterson. Mr. Constant.
Thank you. On behalf of the clerk, I would like to offer to anybody who's listening that we are having an election right now. The election is open. I turned my ballot in yesterday. We are asking everybody to get that ballot in by mail. The drop boxes are available. It's all available on the website. Pay close attention because things are evolving rapidly, but one thing for sure, the clerk will run a good election. The ballots are due on April the 7th, no later, 8 p.m., and it's time.
Thank you, Mr. Constant. Mr. Dyson.
Yeah, two quick things. There's some unexpected ways you can be helpful. My house is full of University of Alaska students who are booted out of the dorm, including some international students. The only thing we're requiring is them to help with the dishes and a few other things and bring 4 rolls of toilet paper with them. The other thing, food bank the blood bank is looking for blood. One of the real reasons people ought to need to be around is I'm type O, universal donor, but they could use 700 pints of type O right away. So people you know that are healthy, tell them to get going. It's helpful for your body's production of hemoglobin. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Dyson. Mr. Weddleton, are you online? Okay. So I have a couple things. First, I wanted to echo what Mr. Constant said. Did he already? If you are, we are having an election. It is going forward. The ballots have been mailed out. We have a number of 18 actually ballot boxes, drop boxes all over the city, and we encourage you to use those. If you have any questions, please call 243-VOTE. That's 243-8683. Madam Clerk, do you have anything to add to that?
Yes, Mr. Chair. Healthy or sick, please don't lick.
I think she's referring to the stamps, not the ballot boxes. The envelopes and the stamps. Two other quick things for my colleagues. Your binders should be out in the hallway. And for Tuesday night's meeting, I have made the decision tonight based on the mayor's hunker down order and a variety of things that have happened over the last week. We are going to close the chamber to the public at Tuesday night's meeting. But we have provided alternative means for the public to participate. We have an email address set up. It's testimony@anchorageak.gov. And we also have a phone number to call in on the night of, and there'll be details up on the municipal website as well, and I imagine we'll probably do a press release on that on Monday as well. But we're going to push that information out there, but again, we are going to, for the health and safety of the public and the people in this room, we are going to close the assembly chambers. I really want to thank my colleagues that called in today. It's very challenging to call in. But because we have passed this ordinance on quorum, I'm also going to encourage all of my colleagues to call in if they can on Tuesday night. And we are going to do everything we can to prevent this from being a place that has a lot of people in it that spreads infection. We are trying to be leaders in the assembly and in the administration to show other entities how we can continue with crucial business while responding to the COVID-19 outbreak. With that, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
We're adjourned.